Hi everybody, thanks for downloading the Fantasy Animation Podcast, brought to you as always by the Fantasy Animation Research Network. If you enjoy the show and you would like to support our endeavours, there's many ways for you to do that. You can follow us on Twitter at FanAnim Research, that's FANANIM Research. And you can follow our latest news and tweets on that. You can access our website at fantasy-animation.org and participate in any of the blog posts. You can get involved in the comments section. We really like you to get involved in the conversations we're trying to start. That would be great. You can offer to contribute a blog at some point further down the line. We're particularly looking for film reviews or book reviews anytime, so if you fancy dopping your hand as a film critic or a film reviewer, please do get in touch then. Or alternatively, if you just like the show and you want to help us to make it even better, you can leave us a review on either of the podcast networks you've downloaded it from. Anything like that will help us increase our visibility on the site, or of course recommend it to your friends and family. Anyway, I'll let you enjoy the show.
Totoro, 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 Totoro.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest fantasy animation podcast with me, Chris Holliday.
And me, Alex Sargent.
For this next instalment, we're sort of moving to Japan, as it were. Mm-hmm. We are taking a look at My Neighbor Totoro. So this is a film by Studio Ghibli from 1988. So sort of a nice counterpoint to Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which we did earlier on. So this is a film that is towards the beginning of Studio Ghibli's history, or certainly an early film in their an early entry in their history, and is a film that sort of engages with what we think fantasy animation in a slightly different way. So its rhetoric of fantasy is slightly different. So for this week, we'll be kind of taking you through the film scene by scene, explaining its relevance within a sort of fantasy context, but also anchoring it to some key issues within animation and animation studies.
Yeah, and I think perhaps before we start, we should probably just do a couple of sentences on Studio Ghibli and is it, first of all, and you can get this sorted for me right now, is it Ghibli or Ghibli?
I've heard both. I've heard something else.
What else have you heard?
Ghibli.
Ghibli? That can't be right. That sounds French.
I mean, let's go with Studio Ghibli.
Right, we're going to go with Studio Ghibli.
Yes.
Perhaps we should sort of give a few sentences on who Studio Ghibli are, because they've got a really interesting place within sort of popular culture, within the history of animation. They're sort of I'm sure there's a lot of listeners who already know who they are and are very familiar with their films. I myself have seen a few, but actually this is my first time seeing My Neighbor Totoro, but even then I sort of had heard of this movie. If I'm right in thinking, isn't Totoro the sort of mascot of the studio? So should we just unpack who these people are and why they're important to talk about?
So I think certainly perhaps for a Western audience, Studio Ghibli represents Japanese animation as a whole, and actually in some ways that's misleading. It sort of has the same relationship. Ghibli's to Ghibli, they have the same relationship to Japanese animation as Disney has to sort of North American animation and sort of cartoon or tradition. So for many Western audiences, they are the face of Japanese animation. So they're a Japanese animation film studio based in Tokyo, and their origins date from sort of the early 1980s. So their unofficial first film, Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind from 1984, was sort of seen as the key starting point for the studio. So founded most notably by Hayao Miyazaki and Toshio Suzuki and Isao Takahata, who recently passed away. So they're sort of within the cultural consciousness. They're also in the cultural consciousness because Miyazaki likes to retire and then come out of retirement at various intervals. And at the recent Society for Animation Studies conference, one of the quiz questions at the annual quiz was, how many times has Miyazaki retired and come out of retirement? So he's sort of it's got its own sort of mythology but it sort of releases these very popular, largely cell animated anime films. It's sort of many of its films are very well known. So kind of going through, we've got Princess Mononoke, perhaps one of the most celebrated is Spirited Away, but they are often seen as the Japanese Japanese Disney. They currently have a really strong industrial relationship with Pixar, and it's the Pixar studio that helps to work on the English language dubbing and release, or the Western release of these films. And I should flag up that the version of Totoro that we watched was the original Japanese language version with subtitles.
But I'll also flag up, if you hear any clips at any point from the movie, and you should do if I get off my arse and do some work, they'll be from the dub version, obviously, for our English-speaking listeners.
So yes, so this is, as I said, My Neighbor Totoro comes towards the beginning of Studio Ghibli's life. And what's interesting about it is that it's in a double feature. So it's actually, or was released alongside another film, Grave of the Fireflies. So Grave of the Fireflies is a slightly more serious in tone. It focuses largely on the impact of nuclear war. So it's set in the city of Kobe, and it's about, like Totoro, it's about familial relationships. A lot of Ghibli films are about the relationship between father and daughter, mother and father, and sisters.
I was actually going to ask you that question. A few of the features of the sort of Studio Ghibli back catalogue seems to be emerging here. So it's cell animation as opposed to digital or stop motion.
Yes.
And they've been one of the leading proponents of that sort of still internationally, yeah?
Yes.
What are the other features of sort of a typical Studio Ghibli
yes.
film?
This is going to get interesting, and the different ways that we can pronounce this. What actually, on the note of cell animation, what's a lot of Japanese anime scholars have kind of positioned this film certainly within the Ghibli corpus, thinking about cell animation and its particular aesthetics. But at the same time, the studio, while it has certainly been a proponent of traditional technique, has worked with CGI, and in the mid-90s it was very interested in using emergent digital technology. I should also flag up the technique of cell shading or toon shading, which is using computer animation and digital effects to look like cell animation. So actually a lot of Ghibli's films are computer animated, but they are, like same as The Simpsons, they are cell shaded or toon shaded, which means that they have a flat rather than three-dimensional quality. One of perhaps the key strands or the key currents of Ghibli as a studio is its relationship to nature. So there's quite a nostalgic view of nature. There are, again, many Japanese anime scholars, such as Susan Napier, have tried to mark out perhaps some of the genres of anime or some of the dominant imagery. And anime is really split between technology, kind of apocalyptic technology, techno-futurism, and these sort of really calm natural landscapes. And so a lot of Ghibli's films, I'm thinking of Wind Rises and its version of The Borrowers, Arrietty, the secret life of Arrietty, are full of kind of natural imagery. And certainly I think we get this with Totoro, the way that the film starts, the place of nature, and the fact that the film isn't really about technology. It's not something like Akira, it's not something like Ghost in the Shell, it's a different kind of, it's not mecha, it's the world of the organic.
I hadn't thought about that distinction between those very two clear types of sort of cycles of anime, but that's really fascinating to learn. From my perspective, watching it as not an expert on the studio's back catalogue, but with my fantasy hat on, the one thing I do know about Miyazaki is he's seen as being very influenced by East meets West sort of tradition of influences. So I know you mentioned the Arrietty, which is an adaptation of The Borrowers.
Yeah.
I know he's also very influenced by the writings of Ursula Le Guin. In fact, didn't he make Howl's Moving Castle? No, Tales from Earthsea is an adaptation of Le Guin's books. He's also influenced by classic Victorian literature, so things like Alice in Wonderland are within the background in a lot of his works, particularly the sort of his recurring feature of the sort of adventurous young heroine. Spirited Away has a lot of flash of that. So I was very interested in watching the movie about how the film felt like a very sort of interesting meditation or enumeration on a lot of classic Western fantasies, and I think there's lots to say as we watch. Well, I've got a lot to say certainly about the way it represents childhood, the relationship between childhood and fantasy in the film, and the way it uses fantasy within its tropes. I think it's a really interesting movie, actually.
It would be no stretch to say that Miyazaki makes animated fantasies. His films are very famously, very clearly, quite durably defined as these are animated fantasies. These are animated fantasy films. So hopefully, what we can do is think about where the fantasy is in that. In some cases, it's obvious, as you say, it's through processes of adaptation, but it will be interesting. And now with my, now with me borrowing your fantasy hat, I watch these films and I'm seeing the fantasy more and more. I'm seeing how we can engage with something like Totoro, not just at the level of form, but of content. And I'm thinking about. So I immediately was thinking kind of Portal Quest fantasy. But we'll get into that.
Terrific. Sure. Well, yeah, that teases things up nicely. So let's. I guess we should run down the basic sort of plot.
Yes.
This is going to involve a lot of pronunciation issues, and my apologies to all.
To our Japanese listeners.
Yeah, well, all listeners who are better at this than I am, and I think a recurring trend on this podcast would be me attempting to pronounce names, and I'm so bad at it. So basically, the story is about a family moving into a new home at the beginning.
Yes.
The family consists of, well, it's classic sort of two children family, mother and father, except mother is in hospital.
Yes.
We don't actually learn that till a bit further on. We start off learning that with the father is sort of on his own. We wonder, so it's father with two young children, Satsuki, Tatsuki, and Mai.
Yeah.
Tatsuki being sort of slightly older.
Yes.
I'm trying to think how old.
So she would be. I think she would fit in within the kind of character archetype of the shoujo. So this sort of in between female figure that is not yet a child and not an adult. And there's lots of writing around the figure of the shoujo. And the shoujo recurs a lot within the Ghibli films.
Okay.
Perhaps the most obvious would be Kiki's Delivery Service and Spirited Away. So Satsuki is a character who's very much of that type. She's very much
not quite adolescent, not quite prepubescent,
but at that exploring the world, and it's that kind of sense of exploration within that cultural category of the shoujo that allows the film through that character to play with the relationship between the real and fantasy.
Yeah. And then we also get Mai, who's much younger. She's sort of,
Yes.
I don't know, 6. So she's actually preschool, isn't she?
Yes.
Sort of, so it must be about 5, 6, something like that.
Yes.
Who I have decided is my favourite character probably ever.
Sure.
I really went with Mai. I thought she was really, really cool. So Mai is sort of this spirited, kind of grumpy, but also very loving young child and the sisters are very close, but at the same time they clash. And they move into this house. It's all sort of grimy. They describe it as a haunted house, but not in a particularly terrified way. They're sort of gleefully happy to be living in a haunted house. And basically we learn about this family and their attempt to sort of settle into the local neighbourhood. They make friends with is it Nana or Nanny, the local sort of elder of this sort of community. And then they start to see various aspirations or encounters with this figure called Totoro, who, let me say these words carefully, is a giant sort of bunny rabbity thing with a massive mouth that doesn't really speak but seems to embody some sort of forest god like creature.
Yes. So the film, and one of the interesting things about the film is that it's a period piece, so it's set in the 50s. Yeah. And so there are some interesting things in the film with regards to the role of technology, the role of tradition, the role of modernity. So once the family has moved into the house, as you say, we don't really know about the mother at this stage. It's really through the characters, and actually I can imagine with Mai that she could very easily grow up to be the lead character of Spirited Away. I can totally see that as given her relationship with her sister, and actually the role of childhood and the role of exploration and the way that fantasy is reacted to by the children. As you say, when the children first move into the house and they start their exploration and they're looking through each individual room and pulling back the doors, sliding back the doors and seeing these creatures, these dust bunny creatures, that really plants the seed of their curiosity. And then from then on, as you say, there are references to ghosts. There's a line of dialogue. Are they like goblins or something? There's some really interesting. They're obviously well versed in fantasy, and they're playing with is this a fantasy space? And actually, at no point are the children really scared of this potential. Their attention, I think, is diverted towards their mother, who's currently in hospital. fantasy therefore allows them to have a little play with these new surroundings.
And what's interesting actually is, as I say, I should clarify, I'm not an expert on Japanese folk traditions or fantasy storytelling traditions. You've mentioned Susan Napier's work; she's a really great scholar to go through on that. But what I was interested in is how the film departed from Western traditions, which I am much more knowledgeable about. And what I found very interesting straight away is that this is a very classic Western story, in that we have childhood and the childlike perspective on life being the entryway for both the viewer and the story's engagement with fantasy.
Yeah.
You get a lot of them cleaning up a room that with things that aren't necessarily fantastic, but they approach it or engage with it as fantastic. And this is a very well-worn trope within fantasy literature, particularly fantasy literature post-Victorian age. And I want to talk more about that as we get on, but there's a very important connection there in that fantasy literature emerges out of Romanticism, and Romanticism is also the artistic movement or the cultural movement that gives us, in our culture, most of our understandings of what it means to be a child as a figure in this world. So if we think about the relationship between children and the imagination, the relationship between children and innocence, all these sort of terms we associate with childhood even to this day, that all comes out of the Romantic era, and it comes out of early Romantic literature. I think I've got a lot to say about that as we go on. But I think what struck me straight away with this this opening is that typically in Western fantasy literature there is a schism between adult and childhood perspectives, and there is to some extent in this movie as we go on. But what you would get in the Western version of this story, or at least a version of this written by Enid Blyton or Lewis Carroll, is you would get the father scolding them for indulging in stories and fairy tales, and you'd get a clash between an adult realist sense of the world and a childhood sense of the world. Interesting, we don't get that here. We get the dad supporting, celebrating, and engaging with their fantasy.
And more than that, so I can totally see the narrative template as fantasy is something that's accessible to children in a way that it's not accessible to adults, and ultimately, as you say, the Enid Blyton version of that story perhaps is that the adult becomes, or tries to at least impress logic upon the child who has seemingly left has within childish ways. So what's interesting about Totoro is that not only does the father sort of encourage this active imagination, perhaps with one eye on his wife being in hospital, it's the kind of figure of the nanny. So and so when the children first engage these sort of fictional dust bunnies, these dust-like spirits that sort of populate the corners and crevices of the derelict house. Once the children have engaged with these dust bunnies and then run back into the main sort of open living area and start to explain, then the nanny figure immediately says, "Oh yeah, they're dust bunnies." And so there's the somehow fantasy is kind of part of the, certainly as embodied by those characters, it's part of the soot spirits are part of this world, and actually, it's the adults that don't discredit or try to ridicule the children. It's that they immediately go with it as well. So I found that quite refreshing.
And there's no moment in the film at all, actually, where they're discouraged from doing that. The film does play with, is this really happening or is it not? Actually, more so in a way that I think some of the stories I've cited so far would do. In those stories, it's not, in Five Children and It, there's no suggestion that the creature is not real, whilst there is a little bit of that going on in this film. But at the same time, there isn't a moment that you're waiting where, I'm thinking of something like, say, a more recent example, something like Pan's Labyrinth, where the mother gets exasperated with Ophelia the child for indulging in all these stories and shouting at her, saying they don't exist, stop doing this is detrimental to your understanding of reality. Here there is no moment like that. It's almost, it's much more permissible to move between the two worlds.
And we're certainly invited, so I was thinking about the first moment of fantasy, if you like, in the film, and so up to a point, this is 1950s Japan. We see kind of cultural markers, or we see markers of Japaneseness. We see the first sequence or the first shot in the film is rice paddies. So we see rice paddies. We then see a series of perhaps events that would fall under the banner of tradition. We see certain kinds of work, certain kinds of eating, certain kinds of bathing, certain kinds of kind of domestic space. These are traditional spaces. So there comes a point, and that would include the dust bunnies. I think the dust bunnies are we're invited to read those as part of that world. They are part of the moment of fantasy for me is the ears poking through the grass.
Mm-hmm. Although I would... The dust bunnies are interesting in terms of the animation style, I would argue, in that they're very well designed because they're just on the cusp between an exaggerated feature of a supposedly mimetic or real space and a fantasy creature. So they sort of have eyes, they sort of have a body, but they don't quite have enough for them to be a fantastical creature. So this is obviously a hyper-designed and exaggerated world because animation's visual style allows you to do that. And it's sort of using that to sort of depict pictorially what we're talking about narratively, right? In that these dust bunnies look like they could be just balls of dust, but they also look like they could be real fantasy creatures.
So the ambivalence that we as the audience feel towards, and to some extent the characters feel towards the possibility of fantasy, then becomes part of the way that the dust bunnies are designed. They are that middle ground between it could be, but it might not be.
Yeah, I think so. Like when I first saw them, I thought, right, okay, are they what the children are seeing, or are they what everybody is seeing?
Yes.
Actually, maybe they are what everybody's seeing, and maybe they're just hyper designed so that they're not, in the same way that food doesn't look like real food in an animation. Things are simplified, designed, exaggerated, made grotesque, all that kind of stuff.
Yes.
So I think there is something interesting going on there, and I have a lot to say about liminality and hesitation and all these sort of lovely words as we get on. But perhaps we'll carry on with the plot at this point.
Yes. So, as I said, the first, I guess, quarter of the film is they're moving in, and through the children, the film gets to set the scene quite literally, because the house itself is relatively derelict, and so it establishes location, and through the characters exploring, the audience is exploring the film's space and the film's kind of logic to include the dust bunnies. Clearly Satsuki is the elder of the two children, is sort of the head of the household. The father, very interestingly, he's a university professor and is typically chaotic, disordered. He has books everywhere, piles of books on the floor, papers. And so one of the early sequences shows Satsuki waking up early and preparing the food for her sister and both him.
And a quick note on that, there is a scene in this movie where the father is so engrossed in his studies that he misses lunch. That has never happened to me.
If I know anything about academics, it's that they'll eat their 3 meals a day.
Yeah, I will very happily put down the books and eat my food.
Yes. And so we have a clear articulation of her character that is as a replacement for the mother. She has taken on the role of the kind of matriarch in that sense. Satsuki then goes to school, leaving Mai and the father at home. And the father is, as I said, engrossed in his work and is working through papers, sitting at his desk and looking out at Mai as she's starting to explore. And it's during one of her first explorations that she sees these two, what we think a rabbit is, in the long grass. What struck me is the transparency of this animal, object, creature, where this creature appears out of the long grass and Mai starts to chase. And then we have the first moment of potential fantasy where the rules are starting to be manipulated ever so slightly, and Mai is the conduit through which we are now seeing the possible fantasy that exists within this relatively remote location. So Satsuki's at school, the father, Tatsuo, is busy working, and Mai is sort of exploring and running through the long grass and under and following these animals, and that's really the first encounter that the audience and Mai have with Totoro.
Yeah, and interesting you use the word rules in that sentence.
Yes.
Because one of the things I noted watching the movie, and actually this is a feature of Studio Ghibli, because the G is silent, as we all know. Yeah. One of their features is that I think rules are really interesting in their movies, and that I find their movies quite ruleless. Not necessarily in a bad way, but quite often Western fantasy, works very hard to quite quickly establish and codify and solidify the ruptures in reality that are taking place. So it would be, again, let's compare this to how I would imagine this is told in a sort of classic Victorian literature way. We would get an immediate explanation of who Totoro is, what his powers are, what he can and can't do, what his limitations are, and then sort of the rupture of possibility is contained, and we have a new equilibrium established, as a scholar called Totoro, who I might talk about in a minute, would say. We get a disequilibrium as the creature is introduced, and then a new equilibrium is established as we get to the end of it. I find Ghibli's movies quite lawless in that respect, in that they don't have that. I still don't quite get who Totoro is. Yes. I don't get the rules of the world. They don't explain why the cat bus is such an important feature of this world, what the cat bus is. There's all these sort of messiness and lurking, and there's almost, I think, dreamlike is the term a lot of people use, or oniric, to give it the sort of more fancy scholarly term.
Yes, I would say that this film at least works to anchor the first 5 minutes within a recognisably Japanese space.
Yes.
Through these markers of tradition, but also it needs to establish some form of or some groundwork upon which it can then have the fantasy. What struck me about this film is fantasy is both character and space, and so it is both a set of intrusive characters, but it is also a space to which the characters visit. And so, yes, I think there is a certain degree of messiness, and the fantasy is not really resolved. My last note on the film is fantasy still exists at the end. And in fact, the last shot of the film is of Totoro. There's never sort of a resolution that Totoro was real, was unreal, was a figment of their imagination. It can't be a figment of their imagination, because logically that can't happen.
I don't mean the whole film is. I think the fantasy in the film is lawless. In a good way, actually. I think the unruliness is interesting. If this, let's compare this with Aladdin. Yeah, Aladdin discovers a magic lamp and rubs it, and suddenly there is a genie of omnipotent power and skill that emerges. We have a rupture in a reality taking place. And then immediately what happens is, right, here I am, I'm a genie, my purpose is to give you 3 wishes, you're only allowed 3, and suddenly rules are introduced,
yes.
and this creature of omnipotence and power and absolute freedom of possibility is suddenly confined to a very clear narrative purpose and key role. You never get that with Totoro. Totoro is left to be this figure of possibility and freedom, and the fantasy sequences, sometimes they fly about, sometimes they get a cat bus, sometimes they just sort of appear as a momentary. It's all very lawless, and there aren't these set introduced laws. I found it endearing in that respect, but it is very different. Oh, sorry everybody, we're just going to interrupt the podcast for a second there, because I want to talk about ratings, Chris.
What do you mean PG, 12, 12A, 15, 18, that kind of thing?
Sure, we can talk about that too, but actually I wanted to talk about iTunes ratings and how you rate this podcast on iTunes and the reasons why you would.
I'd rate it very good. Put that in your...
Well, that would be good too, except you can't do that. The only way you can rate it is to go on the iTunes store, in the podcast info, click ratings, and give us a very quick star review, and then a nice quick sentence review in the comments section. If you do that, that will increase our visibility on the store, and that means we're more likely to attract more audience members, which means more exciting conversations for the future.
Okay, so what you're saying is that listeners give us the 5 stars and then sit back and listen to the show.
Well, implicitly yes, but explicitly yes too.
Gotcha.
We should probably get back to the show now.
Yeah, let's get back to the show. I'm wondering the role that the children are playing in this, and child or adolescent subjectivity, and again, many scholars of Japanese anime have reflected on the role of kind of flying, what flying actually means within the context of these kinds of animated films. Again, Kiki's delivery service, the exuberance of the shoujo youth is manifest through her ability to fly and deliver all these items and objects and artifacts. Yes, I agree. I think if the real or if what we are invited to read as the real of the film is bound by a certain degree of order that is rooted in the cultural Japaneseness of the setting. At the same time, the fantasy doesn't give us anything to. The fantasy the fantasy elements, the fantastic elements are things that constantly move and change shape, figuratively and kind of literally. This idea that the fantasy itself is something that the children can't quite get their hands on, and so we can't quite get our hands on it and figure out the rules and what Totoro is, but also how he relates to the real world. It's as much about how the fantasy relates to the real as how the real is invested in the fantasy. How are we invited to read the fantasy as a set of characters and as a space, given that it sometimes appears and sometimes doesn't. That sequence where they're dancing around the trees and the trees start to grow and grow, and then the next morning the tree isn't there. These are things that are very the world of the film, charged by the fantasy, is very unstable, but that doesn't make it incoherent in a strange way. It doesn't make it's lawless and messy, but it doesn't make it hard to follow.
Yeah,
I think the film is very linear in some senses. It's very conventional. It's very there's never a sense in which I feel that things are dreams. I feel like everything is happening, but it's because it's media. The role of the child as the main character, it does something to the fantasy. Are we witnessing the world through their eyes? I don't know.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think I thought you put it very well when you said that they're trying. We always feel like we are trying to keep up with the fantasy or contain the fantasy. It never can be. The children are always trying to work out the rules. Although actually, I say that I don't think the kids they don't care. But the film is always asking us to try and work out the rules of something that remains ruleless.
So we
that's
know
very interesting.
We know that these aren't. The film tells us that the dust bunnies aren't ghosts. That the Totoro is not a goblin. There's a moment where the characters are laughing about keeping the bogeyman away because they're scared at a particular moment. The children are never scared. What they're scared of is the weather and the isolation of being on their own. The children are never scared of the fantasy.
Nor do they need it to make sense. They don't go, who is this person? What are you doing? Oh, you can grow now. What? How can you do that?
So that's interesting that the children don't need the fantasy to make sense. And I'm wondering whether that, again, is really about the issue of trauma. That these are, and the film has been read a lot in terms of the children using fantasy as a way of processing the trauma of having to move away and that their mother is in the hospital.
Yeah, I thought about that a little bit watching it. I think there are certain visual elements and storytelling elements that invite that kind of almost Freudian,
yes,
this is a dream and we're trying to interpret the dream to find out its real reality. And there, for example, I couldn't help notice that Totoro is very much sort of appears with the absence of a parent figure.
Yes.
And sort of replaces that. We get what I found interesting. There are three. Are there three Totoros, or at least three strange bunny creatures?
Yes, there is the sort of the main Totoro 1.
Totoro 1, Max Totoro.
And then there are certainly there's Totoro 0 and Diet Totoro.
Yeah.
There's certainly a couple of smaller animals or smaller creatures. That are rabbit-like, and certainly that's how Maya immediately sees them. Yes, it's that's undefined. But again, does it matter?
But also, I couldn't help think again with my sort of quasi cod psychoanalytic hat on. We've got the massive Totoro. And then we have a slightly smaller than the child figure, and then a tiny one. And I couldn't help thinking of my Tatsuki and the father in terms of the three relationships between the three of them. We get things like the cat bus mirroring the real bus in real life. It always happens at a moment of trauma and a moment of hallucinogenic. And I think there are certain ways in which you could, if you wanted to, start to interpret the meaning behind the fantasy. But then at the same time, it's a cat bus, and I don't understand that. It's not quite as mirrored as that, and I think there is still I think that ignores a lot of the slipperiness and the indulgence in a good way. I'm not using the word bad, but the indulgence in the fun of magical characters going on here.
So I think the film is therefore really cleverly organised and plotted, because we have the dust bunnies that are framed as not something that only the children see, the nannies. No, these are part of the world.
Yeah.
Then we have a hint that Totoro might be a dream or might be fictitious, because when my first visits and meets Totoro and kind of sleeps and sleeps on its stomach.
Sure.
When my first sleeps on Totoro's stomach, the next scene involves her being woken up and she's lying on the floor. And so the film is giving little hints that, okay, so the dust bunnies are now part of the world. Totoro, that was probably a dream. And then we go to the nth degree. And so the fantasy itself is treated, I think we're invited to read the fantasy as either part of the world or entirely fictitious, and this is all happening within my mind. And then we get the cat bus, which is actually the bit that I don't understand.
Yeah, exactly, and I'm not sure it's meant to be understood. Am I going to have to talk about am I going to have to talk about my friend Todorov at this point?
Yes. My Neighbor Totoro.
My neighbor Todorov. I think I mean, all right. So Todorov is a key fantasy theorist, actually a theorist of something called the fantastic, and very, very briefly, it's a theory that I'm very interested in. It's a theory of what he calls fantasy as hesitation, and the argument is that there are lots and lots and lots and lots of stories whereby a event happens that ruptures the reality of the fiction taking place, actually ruptures the reality of what we would understand as reality. So we are recording a podcast and Chris rubs a magic lamp and a genie pops out. When that happens, you are presented with two possible ways of making sense of that rupture and returning yourself to an equilibrium as opposed to a disequilibrium, as I talked about earlier. One is something he calls the uncanny, which is you accept that you are seeing something that is not real, in which case what you are experiencing is a crisis of perception, not a crisis of worldview. The world still makes sense, you just can't access it properly. Or you experience something called the marvellous, which is that the world doesn't make sense, you haven't understood it properly because you are actually living in a world where genies exist. So either you have to change your understanding of the world, or you have to change your understanding of your own understanding of that world. And a lot of fantasy, or at least a lot of what he calls the literature of the fantastic, plays with that through a period of hesitation. You are asked during the fiction to move between those two states and remain uncertain, and that's where the power dynamic relies. Having said all that, and having just sort of gone on that lengthy spiel, I'm sure I'll mention Todorov again on this podcast at some point, I'm not quite convinced that applies to this kind of story, and I'll propose that what we get here is a story of the marvellous. I don't think there is much in this that is asking us to think that what we are seeing on screen are hallucinations, or at least not take that seriously much longer. But what we get instead, and I think we've hinted at in this lawlessness quality of the fantasy, is almost a hesitation in the marvellous, in that what you get is that, okay, I need to re-understand the laws of the world of the fiction that I'm watching, except at no point do we get the opportunity to reassert those laws. In fact, if anything, as the fiction goes on, those laws become harder and harder to grasp.
It would be interesting to see moments in which these creatures appear, because the sort of the second extended moment where Totoro appears is at the bus stop, and one of the film's iconic images is the two children and Totoro waiting in the rain at the bus stop for their father. Well, certainly the two children are waiting for the father, Tatsuo, to come back from work. He doesn't appear. Mai then falls asleep on Satsuki's back, and Totoro then appears. And so I'm just wondering, because I thought that was a moment where we're now in a sort of dream state, and maybe the film's failure to divide or make a distinction between what we are seeing, what the children are seeing, what is only visible to them, what is only accessible to them, is part of where the messiness comes from. It's all sort of meld together, and ultimately the fantasy is something that is very difficult to trace and attribute logic to. You're hesitating, and I wonder, do the characters hesitate? Do the characters?
No, that's the key thing is that Todorov's argument would be that happened. That the key one of the fundamental ways in that happens is that the character hesitates. So you're reading it. So The Fall of the House of Usher, a classic Edgar Allan Poe ghost story. A character is narrating an event, and you don't know whether the character has gone mad or whether they are living in a haunted house. That doesn't happen here. There is no hesitation within the narrative. So it's really what you bring to it as a viewer that we're talking about here. And then we're into some really slippery things surrounding cultural context, all this kind of stuff as to, you know, how one wants to rationalise what they see. I get the feeling if we were, you know, reading an interview with Miyazaki, he would be very keen for us to do that.
Yes, I think it's the role of. I mean, I'm looking at some of the stuff around the film in terms of the relationship between modernity and nostalgia. Its creation of a fantastic fantasy world that is strangely believable and marks the collision between supernatural elements and real world markers. And it seems to be that the world itself is entirely dreamlike, and therefore the world itself is open and accessible to the children as desiring a certain kind of fantastic retreat. And it feels like as part of their working through of their trauma, or as part of their dislocation from their complete family structure, we're led to believe, because the mother is in hospital, that the relocation to a new space that they're unfamiliar with and that they wish to explore allows them to start playing with the fantasy of this unknown space. So they don't hesitate because the fantasy is not something that intrudes upon them, it's something that originates from them. So why would they hesitate? Why would they be feel strange towards the appearance of a creature if the creature itself is not part of their own? I don't know, it feels like the children are quite central to this in terms of the way that the fantasy in the film is managed. It's the children that are the centre, and this is typical of Ghibli. If we think of something like Spirited Away, that the fantasy is something that is certainly positioned to emanate from the child character, and it's because of that we don't fail to believe that Totoro is real to them.
It's typical of Jai Bibelai, but it's also typical of just fantasy literature. Yeah, fantasy literature is the literature told from the child's perspective. And I would stress it that way. I mean, the thing I thought about a little bit was, I'm glad you brought, because I wanted to talk about the representation of childhood. There's a great book by Ewan Kirkland on children's media, who argues something very important that I think has stuck with me ever since I've read it, which is this idea that we talk about childhood and children is the only social category we don't talk about as a social category. So unlike something like gender or race or disability or anything like this, where there are certain biological realities to deal with, but largely you're talking about a cultural social construct, the same is true of childhood, right? There is no child's way of viewing the world. There is no children. There is only a social category of children. And his argument is, why don't we talk about children's literature like that? And I think the other key thing to that is it's not the only social category that gets this problem. We're having a worldwide conversation about the lack of diversity of storytellers right now, but it is it's one that we don't question quite as much. Is why do all children's stories get told to them by adults telling them what children are like? Yeah. So I'm thinking about this film and how it presents what childhood is, and to me it has some of the elements of what I might call sort of, you know, very cod-like and very generalised Western fantasy. So an association between fantasy and children, a more sort of imaginative sensibility. But I think one of the key things that struck me here is also a much closer relationship to the natural world and to nature.
Yes.
That's something in certain fantasy movies and fantasy stories in the sort of UK, Europe, US tradition, but it's not quite as prevalent in here. Here, it's very much the adults are separated from the natural world. Yeah, the fantasy spaces are the forests,
yes,
the untamed places, whilst the adults spend their life in houses or in gardens or on cultivated rice fields and things like that.
Yes, lots of the film takes place outside.
Yeah.
And actually the division between inside and outside space is certainly within their home, because of the sliding doors, is rendered imperceptible. So the inside becomes the outside, but the father is very much working in a series of interior spaces. So his office and his university space. The children are free to explore under, through, across all these really interesting, under a tree, through a sort of like a portal that connects one natural space to another natural space. And so certainly the film has its own connection to nature. The children have a connection to nature. There's one instance, and this returns us to the cat bus. There's one instance where
I'm so glad we're back to the cat bus.
Yeah.
I'm very pleased to be back
next
to the cat
stop,
bus.
this again. There's one line where I think it's Satsuki says towards the end of the film where they've boarded the cat bus and they are.
Do you want to just start let's get to the ending. So the ending is.
So once Mai has disappeared, and so the remaining sort of 25 minutes of the film is Satsuki running around trying to find her.
And she's disappeared very interestingly because she wants to bring these vegetables that Nanny has told her are really, really sort of life restoring. She wants to take them to her mum, so she's trying to walk to the hospital but gets lost.
She also has a falling out with her sister, and ultimately Maya then goes off and is lost. Then the final act of the film is trying to find this missing child, and Satsuki, it's very energetic. She's a character on the move. In fact, she's a character on the move throughout the whole film. She's often running to places and keeping very, very busy, and that perhaps feeds into her role as head of the household. So, with the mother not in good health, it's left to Satsuki to and the father seemingly unable to organise his personal and professional life. It's up to the oldest daughter to try and find the younger child, and this really sets the scene for the final act where Satsuki must call on the fantasy to resolve the narrative, and so through Totoro and through meeting Totoro, and she decides to enter into this porthole. She finally meets Totoro. They have a sort of, I'll use the word conversation quite loosely. And
just to pause there, it's really interesting. I haven't mentioned this thus far. We haven't got time to go into it much. Is almost all the interactions with Totoro and the creatures are non-verbal.
Yes,
which is another sort of I could start quoting Lacan and signifiers and entrance into the symbolic, but I think it's Saturday morning here and I've just had a croissant, so I'm not going to do it. But there's something interesting between childhood non-verbal and language being something belonging to the adult world.
Yes,
but yeah.
I wonder whether
that's what we call an audio footnote there,
yes.
Everybody.
For further.
Yeah.
But is that something...
See the mirror stage.
Yeah. Is there something to do with the way that we engage with fantasy, that it's predominantly visual and spatial and experiential, it's not verbal?
Well, except that fantasy storytelling is almost entirely verbal.
So this film really positions the fantasy as something that is in the design and the visual style of the film. Totoro never really speaks. It groans and makes some kind of noise. But they're able to communicate. And ultimately, Satsuki then boards the cat bus and they go off to try and find... And the cat bus is this floating, flying bus that's a cat that is able to change destinations. So the first destination is Mai. So they then go and find Mai. And she is sitting kind of alone. And that's really that's kind of a great resolution between the two sisters, but it's the first moment where the adults are not able to see the fantasy. The cat bus is the only fantasy element of the film, and Satsuki says at one point they can't see the bus. It's humans, but particularly adults that don't have access to witness the fantasy in the same way as the children. Once the two sisters are together again, the destination on the cat bus changes and it's to the hospital. So they go off to the hospital. Now this last scene is very intriguing because you have the two children sitting on a branch in a tree outside the hospital and looking in at the father and the mother. The mother has previously, yes, she's been ill, she was supposed to return home, has been asked to stay in for a few more days, and I think that kickstarts some of the fractures between the two. In fact, it does kickstart the fracture between the two children.
And I'm very much Team Mai, I should say.
Right.
Hashtag Team Mai.
Right, fine. That you believe that it's the mum should have returned home.
No, more that I don't really care about. I can't remember her name. What's her name? Satsuki. I'm not. I don't care. I like Mai. I think Mai's far more interesting a character. Thoughts?
Yes, she's much more expressive, and being slightly younger,
She's untamed as well. So
Yes.
back to untamed qualities. She's, she feels things in various moments, and she doesn't, she almost like isn't a very consistent character, and that's what I quite like about her.
There's a really funny bit in the movie where Mai and the nanny turn up at Satsuki's school,
Yeah.
and Satsuki's like, I can't possibly, I'm at school, I can't cut, and Mai's just sitting in the middle of the classroom, big grin on her face, and she becomes the focus of attention. It's also interesting that she's an artist. So in the school sequence, Mai is drawing fantasy creatures, and so again, if the children somehow have access to a fantasy that the adults perhaps don't, but also the adults don't discredit, equally Satsuki and Mai's relationship never fractures because of one's belief in the fantasy over the other.
Should we talk about animation briefly at that point as well? I mean, I don't know if I have anything to say about it, but I feel we've been quite focusing on the fantasy, which I've been loving. But like, there's also something about drawing and expressing. We were talking about this last week actually on the podcast about sort of why don't we consider the act of drawing an act of fantasy quite as much as we do the act of telling a story.
Well, it goes back to what you were saying about childhood.
Yeah.
The thing that connects fantasy and animation is potentially the role of the child. That animation is considered a childish medium. That debate has really been done to death, to the extent that it's not a childish medium. It's aimed at children in some sense, but these are adults animating these films. So
I mean, ditto fantasy,
exactly.
Same debate, same problem.
So I wonder whether the slash between fantasy and animation is really the word childhood on its side. That actually, that childhood is a really interesting place where,
as a cultural social construct, right?
Yeah, that has something to say about the relationship that animation has to fantasy, that fantasy has to animation, and some of the terms of an animated fantasy. It's interesting in the case of Ghibli that children become Ghibli, that characters themselves are children. And I'm trying to think of comparisons that certainly Disney films, Pixar to a lesser extent, but they're often not young children. If you think of Inside Out as Pixar's first real, I mean, Andy is a child in Toy Story, but he's not the focus. And I think the continual focus on the potential of the child protagonist in the Ghibli films is something that is a way into thinking about the narrative role of the fantasy for those characters. Is it an escape? Is it a set of characters? Is it a space that they travel to but return? In this instance, they move quite freely between the fantasy space and the real space. They go in and visit story and come back. The last shot of the film is Totoro sitting on top of a tree looking out. Well, the fantasy exists as part of that world. So the resolution is as messy as the journey that got us there, in some sense.
Absolutely. I think the resolution is as messy as the journey that got us there is probably an adequate description of this podcast as well. So that's probably a good point to put a full stop on this conversation. Hopefully, I'm sure we will get to some more studio insert own comedy pronunciation here in the future, and maybe I'll learn to pronounce some names properly by then. Chris,
yes.
Where can people find you on Twitter?
So they can find me. As in my faction.
Yeah. He's whispering. I'm not going to edit this out, so I don't know why you're whispering
right.
it. Yes.
You can find me at Chris Holiday 7.
You can find me at Freud is Funny,
and you can find us at Fan Anim Research.
Please do get involved with the conversations online there. We'd love to hear what you think about some of the issues here. There's lots to unpick in this movie, and it's a fun one to do. And also hashtag Team My or hashtag
Team Satsuki.
That would be nice. Get that going on Twitter, and people won't understand what on earth we're all talking about. That's good. But for now, thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.